FBI Director Robert Mueller testified before a House subcommittee this afternoon on the FBI's budget. Members took the opportunity to ask the director about FBI procedure in detaining terrorism suspects and about gang violence on the U.S.-Mexico border, among other topics. This is just over 2 hours.
Hearing will come to order. Good afternoon. The subcommittee would like to welcome Robert Mueller, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to discuss the FBI's 2011 budget request and related issues. We're pleased to have you here, Director Mueller, and thank you for your appearance. The FBI's budget request for 2011 totals nearly $8.2 billion. Within such a large total, there are clearly many programmatic and policy issues to cover, too many, in fact, for any one hearing to cover exhaustively. But I do hope that we can use this opportunity to focus on at least a few important areas and make sure we touch on those which we consider of high priority. The first of these areas for me is white-collar crime. Our economy has suffered billions of dollars in losses due to the illegal and immoral behavior of individuals who capitalize on weaknesses in the regulatory and enforcement system to profit at the expense of shareholders, investors, homeowners, workers, and taxpayers. While many firms on Wall Street have recovered and are in fact making substantial profits again, there are millions of regular Americans who are still hurting and have yet to see any real justice for the economic violence that was perpetrated on them. I'm glad to see that this administration has recognized the error of past practices and is now proposing to invest in your fraud enforcement programs rather than raiding those resources year after year to pay for other priorities, Mr. Director. This is the priority now. What remains to be determined is whether the size of this investment is sufficient to the size of the problem. Your budget request proposes to add 62 new agents for white-collar crime, but compared to the thousands of active cases and billions of dollars of losses, the question is, does that seem small? And I'm anxious to explore this during your testimony. A second area of concern is law enforcement in Indian country. This subcommittee has heard many times and from many different people how desperate the law enforcement situation is really in Indian country. Unfortunately, it's not obvious exactly how to solve this problem. Will clarifications to the jurisdictional construct help? Will more agents or more prosecutors or better evidence processing capabilities, will that do the trick? Do we need to focus on building community trust between the tribes and federal law enforcement entities, or on significant substance abuse programs among tribal populations? I'm sure that these are all elements of the solution, and the key is to find the right mix of those elements. Your budget contains some resources to address one part of this mix, and that request is certainly welcome. For too long, the FBI has failed to request the resources necessary to improve its presence in Indian country or to follow up aggressively on the execution of existing funds to make sure that the resources you have are actually reaching the Native American communities for which they are intended. A final area that I think needs to be addressed at this hearing is the treatment of terrorism suspects apprehended in the U.S. This issue emerged in a major subject of debate after the arrest of Omar Farouk Abdul Muttalib in December, when a whole spectrum of public figures alleged that the FBI's provision of Miranda rights to Abdul Muttalib was unnecessary, misguided, and perhaps even detrimental. In reality, there was no difference between the handling of this case and the way the FBI always handled these cases in the past is the position of the administration. And there were no criticisms, apparently, when the FBI gave virtually identical treatment to David Headley, Nujabullah Zazi, to name recent examples, or to dozens of others apprehended during the previous administration. I'd like to think that much of the current criticisms and misrepresentations are just the result of some misunderstandings about what's taken place in this case. The fact of the matter is that the FBI has made it clear that it sent experienced, knowledgeable agents to question Abdul-Muttalib. Beyond this one particular case, I believe there are also some fundamental misunderstandings of the overreaching legal framework in which you operate when someone is apprehended within our borders for committing or attempting to commit a terrorist act. Can that person legally be held without charge or without the provision of certain constitutional rights? Whether he is a U.S. citizen or not, once in custody, what are the provisions with regard to his advice on rights and to remain silent, his right to retain counsel, and the government's right to use statements against him? These are all questions which I'm sure will be explored. The FBI simply cannot take a suspect apprehended domestically and just pack him off to Guantanamo Bay. You can't turn him over to the CIA, which does not have authority to operate domestically, and you can't decide to give him to the military, where, by the way, he would still be entitled to constitutional rights. I understand that that there are differences of opinion, and we look forward to exploring them in the context of the reality and the Constitution in which we find ourselves. I intend to propose to pursue these topics in more detail during our rounds of questioning, and I also hope to address some newly emerging problems with the development of the Sentinel case management system. This is a critical effort and one that absolutely must succeed in order for the FBI to fully bring its investigative technology into the new century. Before we get into these issues, however, I'd like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Wolf, for any comment he may have.